The can struck her just beneath the left eye, a sharp, metallic clack followed by the hiss of carbonation, and for a moment, even the insects in the trees seemed to stop buzzing. She didn't growl, didn't snarl, didn't run. She froze. Thick fur matted instantly as cold cola splattered across her face and muzzle, dripping down the fine white fur of her throat, soaking into her chest like oil and sand. She blinked rapidly, disoriented by the sudden sting of carbon dioxide near her eyes, by the foreign chemical sweetness clinging to her nostrils. Laughter echoed from the ridge above. 3 silhouettes, half obscured by the thorny scrub and granite outcrop, one of them crouched behind a phone, the other still holding the empty red can, its silver tab glinting in the sunlight as if proud of its cruelty. She didn't even flinch. One of them said in Spanish, between snorts of laughter, "Stupid cat just stood there. Look at her. Like she's confused." But confusion wasn't the word, and what they saw wasn't stupidity. It was calculation, a paw sharpened by years of evasion, of pain, of encounters that always ended in wounds, and sometimes worse. The leopard didn't blink again. She simply stood, a lean, muscular silhouette dappled in golden brown and soft gray, glistening now with thin rivulets of cola that caught the sun. Her ears flicked back once, then forward. Then she lifted her head slowly, deliberately, and stared up the slope toward the men. Not past them, not through them, directly at them. And in that stillness, that perfect, unnerving stillness, the men went quiet. The phone lowered slightly. The laughter faltered because something in her stare made the air feel different, heavier. Not just a predator watching, but something older, something that remembered every bruise and insult carved into its flesh by hands like theirs. They expected her to run. They'd said it would be funny, that the cat would bolt and slip on the wet rock, that they'd post it online and it'd go viral. But she didn't move, not backward, not forward, just watched, as if memorizing their faces or choosing something. She's not gonna. The third man started. Then she turned and vanished between the rocks. No rustle, no snap of twig, not even paw print remained when they climbed down to look. She had dissolved into the landscape like steam into air. Far below, in the lower basin of the valley, Sarah Holt tightened the strap of her field recorder. Her boots pressed carefully into patches of dry grass and exposed clay as she moved closer to the shallow riverbed, not for any hunt or research, but to document something subtler, a pattern she'd been noticing over the past 3 weeks, and that no one seemed to take seriously. Half-consumed livestock, goats, mostly dumped near trails, but with signs that the kills weren't made by predators at all. The incisions were too clean, almost surgically cautious, like someone trying to lure a carnivore into a trap. And this valley, this fractured, feral stretch of Chile's southern wild, was the perfect place for something like that to go unnoticed. There were rumors, sure, old stories from rangers and villagers, whispers of a leopard surviving in the cliffs after a failed illegal zoo transport decades ago. The animal was said to have escaped when the smugglers' vehicle crashed, a young female that disappeared into the canyons, too smart to be recaptured, too wild to die. She would have been long gone or dead by now, if she even existed. Sarah didn't believe the myths. She believed in evidence, in prints, in markings, in scat. And yet, that morning she had found something else. Entirely soda-colored fur clinging to a wet rock, faint stickiness in the grass, and a single red aluminum can, bitten at its base, as if someone or something had tried to puncture it with canines. She'd bagged it and left the scene, but the images swirled in her mind now as she moved. The scorched smell of sugar on warm fur, the unnatural blend of citrus and blood in the air. She paused as her radio buzzed weakly. Lucas's voice came through, clipped, static-laced, but unmistakably tense. Something just came through the east ridge. Dogs going crazy. You. Nearby? I'm by the old stream path. 10 minutes out. What happened? I don't know. Just... He stopped. Static again. I think we're being watched. 3 kilometers east. The same 3 men from the ridge gathered around the back of their truck. The phone video already uploading. One of them still laughing, replaying the footage. She just stood there, bro, like a statue. You got that part? But one man stood apart from them, the one who had thrown the can. His fingers trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, not from guilt, but from something colder. That moment of eye contact was lodged in his brain. The stillness. The intensity, not animal fear, something else. Something that saw him, really saw him. Night crept over the valley like a bruise. Cold and sudden, and the wind changed direction, up in the cliffs. Beneath a gnarled cedar that had grown from stone, the leopard crouched silently, her fur still damp from the cola, her eyes open and unblinking as she watched the flickering headlamps in the distance. She did not clean herself, not yet. The stickiness was foreign. But it masked her scent, and the cold had evaporated. What remained was memory. She did not hunt for vengeance, not the way humans did, but she remembered pain, remembered being cornered as a cub, remembered the smell of men, and blood and burning, and this insult, this humiliation of sweet poison in her face. This was not forgotten. She would wait, and when they returned, because they always did, she would remind them what it meant to be. Watched by something not built to forgive, Sierra knelt by the shallow riverbed just before dawn. Brushing her fingers over the mud, faint tracks emerged beneath her. Not dog, not puma. Something heavier, older, silent and wet. She felt it before she saw it. That sensation of being in someone else's territory, of being judged. Weight of no longer being at the top of the food chain. She stood slowly, brushing off her knees, the dawn wind stirring the cola-sweet scent lingering in the air. Somewhere above her, the silence pressed closer. The sound of laughter had long vanished, and something in the valley had changed, forever. The morning light broke like cracked glass across the cliffs. Not warm, not golden, just sharp and colorless. And Lucas Pina stood in the threshold of the old ranger station, staring at the deep claw marks carved into the door. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. 4 jagged slashes ran diagonally from just beneath the window to the base of the wood. Splinters still curled along the edge, like paper burned at the corners, and just below the final gouge. Someone, or something, had left a streak of ochre-colored dust that seemed deliberately smeared in a half-circle. Lucas crouched, touched the mark with his gloved hand. It was dry, powder-fine, not natural brick dust maybe, or mineral clay, but it hadn't been there the night before. There were no tracks in the soil, no paw prints, no drag lines. The ground was too firm, too packed from the summer drought, but he could feel it. Something that stood here, something that didn't care to hide, not anymore. Inside, the air smelled like rust and dried herbs, a shelf of field guides, unopened, a steel thermos of bitter yerba mate he'd forgotten to clean out 2 days ago. Still warm, he hadn't even been gone long. He'd stepped out for 20 minutes to check a camera trap upstream, and something had come to the door while he was gone, not to break in, not to feed, but to say something, to speak without language. He stood, walked outside, scanned the trees. Nothing moved, but he felt watched, a weight on the back of his shoulders like breath against skin, invisible, but pressing. He radioed the only person he trusted to understand what it meant. Sierra Holt was halfway up. Slope when the call came through. The old ridge trail that twisted along the edge of the ravine like a coiled spine. She had been following a cluster of half-dried blood smears that led off a goat path. Too clean, too precise, and too recent to ignore. She stopped, pressed her radio to her ear. Lucas's voice came through grainy but urgent. "Something's wrong. She's not hiding anymore. She left a mark at my door." Sarah didn't ask who she was. They hadn't agreed on names, but they both knew what it meant. The Leopard. "She's tracking them," Lucas said after a long silence. "Not hunting, not yet, but something's coming." Sarah's breath caught. She looked around instinctively, scanned the rocks, the trees, the sky. "You think she's circling the station?" "No. I think she's circling the people who heard her, and we're standing in the middle, 2 valleys east." The town of Valmira stirred to life in uneven waves. Old jeeps rumbling through dust, tin rooftops clattering in the rising wind, and outside the local bar, the same 3 men from the video leaned against their vehicle, laughing over fresh footage and cracked jokes, all except one. The one who had thrown the can stood silently, his face pale despite the sun, his hands fidgeting with a cigarette he hadn't lit, replaying the video in his mind over and over. But not the part they liked to laugh at. He remembered her stare, the unblinking stillness, the sound of cola hissing on fur, the way she had simply watched him, as if she knew who he was, what he'd done. He hadn't slept. He told them he heard something outside his shed last night, clawing at the metal, but when he went out, nothing was there. Only the smell, faint, sour, like wet fur and burnt citrus, and a paw-shaped smear on his car window. They laughed it off, called it guilt, called it paranoia, but the image wouldn't leave him. Sarah returned to the ranger station before noon. Lucas met her at the edge of the clearing. She saw it instantly. The claw marks, the dust, but more than that, the precision. "She's communicating," Sarah said quietly. "She's not just reacting, she's planning." Lucas nodded once. "There's something else." Trail cam picked up movement near the wash line. Not a big cat, not a human either. Something in between. He handed her the tablet, grainy footage loaded. And there she was, low to the ground, shadow passing through moonlight, soaked coat still patchy with sticky residue, her movements slow, but controlled, like a soldier moving behind enemy lines. And then she looked directly at the camera, only for a second, but it was enough. That stare again, like a question with no answer, or an answer no one wanted to face. Sarah zoomed in, frame by frame, and noticed something new. A piece of the soda can wedged into her side. It hadn't just sprayed her, it had cut her. Thin aluminum slicing into skin during the impact. Likely infected by now, but she hadn't flinched, hadn't stopped, hadn't even limped. "She's wounded," Sarah said, and still moving with strategy. "That's not instinct, that's something else." Lucas looked at her. "How long before someone reports another attack?" "Depends," Sarah replied. "Are they smart enough to leave her alone?" They both knew the answer. Later that evening, a local news segment broke across national networks. Someone had leaked the Coke video to a larger media outlet. The title read, "Predator in the Pines. Tourists targeted by leopard in Chilean highlands." The clip was edited. No sign of the can being thrown. No laughter. Just a grainy zoom in on the leopard turning toward the camera, frozen in mid-stare and dramatic. Narration warning about attacks on nearby livestock and hikers. The victim narrative had begun, and the predator was being rewritten into the villain of someone else's story. Sarah stood in the ranger station watching the report with her jaw clenched. Lucas paced beside her, fists tight at his sides. "This is going to get her killed," he muttered. "They're going to come with guns, permits, drones maybe. Not if we find her first," Sarah said. "Not to capture, not to call her, just to move her, to warn her." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You think she'd listen?" "I don't know," Sarah answered. "But I've been stared down by a lot of predators in my life. None of them looked at me like that one did." Across the valley, under a narrow crescent moon, The leopard lay curled in the hollow of a stone basin, chest rising and falling in shallow rhythms. Her side ached. The place where the can had cut her pulsed with heat, but she did not lick it, did not groom it. Instead, she listened to the wind across the trees, to the tires on distant gravel, to the silence that followed whenever people passed. The way the forest itself held its breath, as if fearing what she might do next. She had never been one to provoke, never lingered near humans, had learned long ago that their scent led to pain. But this was different. They had touched her, not with claws, not with tooth, but with humiliation, a kind she could feel long after. The sugar dried on her fur, and now she was following their trail, not blindly, not furiously, but patiently, methodically. She did not know the word revenge, but she knew its shape, its rhythm, its echo in the bones of prey long after the chase ended. She was not chasing, not yet, but she was closing the distance. Sierra climbed the eastern ridge before midnight, following the ghost line of movement captured by the trail cams. She moved slowly, flashlight off, every few steps stopping to listen, to breathe with the land instead of over it. And then, halfway up the slope, she found the prints. Not deep, not defined, but unmistakable four-toed. Large, symmetrical, and recent. She knelt beside them, pressed her fingers into the soil, felt the warmth still lingering, and something else, a smear of syrup, faint, sticky, barely there, but enough to confirm. The timeline. The leopard had passed here, not hours ago, minutes. Sierra didn't call out, didn't chase, she simply stayed still. Then, from somewhere beyond the trees, not far, came a sound she hadn't expected. Not a growl, not a cry, but a low, rattling cough, like a bark muffled by wet lungs. A warning, or a challenge, or perhaps a request to be understood. She rose slowly, heart pounding, and whispered into the dark. I saw what they did to you. Silence. Then, rustling brief, a shadow flicked between the tree trunks like wind-shifting dust. Gone before her eyes could fix on it, but she knew what it meant. She was being watched, and, for now, spared. They didn't find the first carcass until 2 days later. A dog, local. One of the tracking breeds used by poachers to flush wildlife from the thorn scrub and chase them into exposed gullies. Its body was found curled beside the dry riverbed, spine arched, eyes open, not torn apart. Not eaten, just dead. No blood, no struggle. Just a clean break at the neck, swift, merciful even, if not for the message it carried. Lucas stood over the animal in silence, his boots motionless in the red clay. Sierra arrived minutes later, her shadow long and stretched across the bank. Neither of them spoke for a while. The dog had a collar, leather, engraved with a name, Mateo, and an emblem Lucas recognized. They're here again, he muttered. Same group, the ones from the video. Sierra knelt slowly beside the dog, careful not to disturb the body, then reached into her pack and pulled out a sealed sample bag. She scraped something from the fur just behind the ear, barely visible, a smear of sticky, dark residue. She opened the bag, held it to her nose, winced. Cola, she said. Same scent as before, same profile. She was here. Lucas turned to look at the ridge above them. Dry wind tugged at his jacket. The trees swayed but made no sound. She's not avoiding them anymore, he said. She's mapping them. They found the second carcass that evening. Another dog, this time on a poacher's trapline 2 kilometers west of Valmira. Rope snares torn apart, tree limbs gouged with fresh claw. Marks and a single aluminum fragment resting on the trail. Curved like a tooth, red paint flaking from its edge. Sierra picked it up with gloved fingers, turned it toward the fading light, and saw where it had bent under pressure. Bitten again, just like the can at the scene of the assault. She's carrying it, Sierra said, like a scent marker or a warning. Lucas shook his head. Not just to them, to everyone. They both understood what it meant. This wasn't random. This was a hunt, but not one for food, across the valley. The poachers had grown nervous, their banter colder, their weapons closer. One of them kept a rifle across his lap even while drinking. Another started sleeping in his truck. The man who had thrown the can, the one they called. Dario had changed most of all. He didn't joke anymore, didn't eat, just stared at the tree line behind their cabin as if expecting something to appear. He told the others he'd seen her eyes again, not in dreams, but in real life, staring through the fog one night as he pissed behind the tool shed, unmoving, watching him. "She's not scared of us," he whispered. "She's waiting." They told him he was cracked, told him to drink more, smoke something, but in the silence that followed, none of them laughed. Sierra traced the pattern. Dog kills, shredded snares, aluminum fragments. The trail led in a slow spiral inward, each site closer to the center of the valley, closer to the men themselves. She spread the map across the floor of the ranger station, circled each point with red grease. Pencil, drew thin lines between them, paused, and then leaned back slowly. "It's not just strategy," she said. "It's intelligence. She's shaping their territory like it's hers, narrowing their routes, boxing them in." Lucas nodded. "She's predicting their movements, forcing them into the gorge. That's where they first threw the can." Sierra added, "That's where it started, and that's where she's pulling them back." A slow breath passed between them. Not fear, not awe, something harder to name. Respect. That night, one of the poachers disappeared. He'd gone out with 2 dogs to check a camera they'd left on the southern ridge. When the others found him hours later, the dogs were dead, throats slashed, no signs of struggle, and the man was gone. No blood, no trail, no shell casings, just one broken branch near the edge of a ravine, and beside it, something worse, a boot print, human, facing downhill, and beside it, a paw print, massive, fresh, pressed into the wet earth like a seal on a letter. The man who found it screamed, not out of pain, but panic, and ran all the way back to the cabin barefoot. Sierra received the call the next morning, not from the men, but from a local teen who had stumbled across their campsite and overheard them arguing. She warned that they were planning something, not just traps, but fire. "They think smoke will flush her out," the girl said. "They want revenge, not just protection." Lucas clenched his jaw. "We need to move before they do something irreversible. We're already too late." Sierra whispered. "She's 3 steps ahead of them." That night, they returned to the cliffs, not to trap, but to burn. They doused the lower ridge in accelerant, old diesel drums and paraffin-soaked cloth, and at sundown, they lit it. The fire spread in sharp, angular streaks across the slope, turning sky to ember. Birds fled in chaos. Smoke rolled upward in thick, suffocating sheets. And through it all, they waited. Dario stood just outside the ring of firelight, rifle in hand, sweat shining on his forehead despite the cold. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared into the black space between trees, and then a sound, not loud, not growl or roar, just breath. So close. He turned sharply, aimed, fired. The shot rang into the smoke and disappeared. Nothing fell. No movement followed. But the others had seen it too. A shadow, low and fast, circling behind them, not attacking, just reminding them. She was inside the fire's radius now, and they were the ones trapped within it. Sierra and Lucas arrived as the fire crept up the ridge's far side. Too late to stop it, but not too late to find the path she had taken. She hadn't run from the flames. She'd used them. Her tracks were visible in the soot, perfect, deliberate, weaving between plumes, skirting the edge of danger like someone familiar with its rules. "She's not escaping," Lucas said, watching the trail vanish into darkness. "No," Sierra replied. "She's finishing the map. At dawn, the smoke lifted in slow, serpentine drifts across the valley floor. Trees smoldered, birds returned cautiously, and somewhere above, unseen, a shape moved quietly through the ash. Light-footed, unburned, her coat darkened by soot but her eyes still clear. She paused on a high bluff and looked down at the men breaking camp, watched them load their weapons back into trucks with trembling hands, heard their voices crack under the weight of something they couldn't name. It wasn't just fear, it was defeat, because they understood now. They weren't being hunted by instinct or desperation. They were being taught a lesson by something older than they could grasp, a predator that had rewritten the boundaries, not just of land, but of power, back at the ranger station. Sarah stood over the map again. This time, she traced the spiral in reverse, inward. All roads led to one place, the gorge, where it began, where she had been humiliated, and where she now waited. Not for vengeance, but for recognition. The hunter was no longer just surviving. She was shaping the story, and it would end on her terms. The wind shifted, and with it, the forest lost its silence. Ash particles drifted across the undergrowth like whispers, rising from a blaze that should never have started. A reckless flick of a match by someone who would never admit to it. A laugh that echoed down the ridge just before the flames caught dry leaves. Maeve stood at the edge of the narrow gorge, boots coated in red dust, a drone controller gripped tightly in her gloved hands, the map on. Her tablet had turned from green to orange, then red, the thermal overlays pulsing with heat signatures that weren't supposed to be there. She knew wildfires, but this was different. This wasn't nature's tantrum, it was a message, and it burned. From her left, a sudden crackle of brush. Not flame, but movement. Heavy, rhythmic. She turned instinctively, and there, for just a breath, she saw the leopard again, cloaked in soot. Fur clinging to her muscular frame. Her eyes no longer golden, but shadowed with red light. A phantom forged in fire. Smoke surged behind her, and Maeve knew the cat was being driven. Not fleeing. Someone or something was forcing her down this path, toward the cliff edges where escape became death. Maeve's voice barely rose above a whisper as she pressed the radio. "Oren, she's moving east, toward the escarpment. Someone's pushing." This isn't random. On the other end, silence, then static. Then Oren's voice, strained. "We found the tracks, not hers. Boots, 3. No ranger gear, and shell casings. Maeve, someone's hunting her." Maeve didn't respond. She didn't have to. Her feet were already moving, fast, down the slope, every step echoing with urgency. Every tree she passed seemed to cry out, their trunks blackened by creeping fire, their branches trembling under ash-heavy air. This wasn't just about the leopard anymore. It was about control, about power, about someone trying to erase a creature they couldn't tame. A loud burst rang through the valley, sharp, close. Not the dry crack of fire, but a rifle, a predator in human skin. The leopard snarled, and Maeve's heart slammed against her ribs. She caught a glimpse, not of the shooter, but of the aftermath. A gouge in a tree trunk, splinters flying, too close to the cat. And then, the forest screamed. Flames ignited a pocket of dry leaves below, and the fire raced, faster than thought, engulfing a narrow deer path the leopard had just crossed. Maeve skidded to a halt, face flushed from heat, chest burning. Somewhere behind the smoke, the leopard let out a low growl, not fear, but fury. She wasn't running anymore. She was circling, turning. Her path into a trap, Oren emerged from the shadows with 2 other rangers. Rifles slung low, eyes wide. It's arson. Deliberate. They used accelerants, probably diesel. We've never seen a blaze move this way. Maeve nodded, gaze still scanning the trees. She's not running. She's baiting. Whoever's hunting her doesn't understand what they've cornered. Then, A second explosion, not fire, but a small detonation, a rudimentary trip flare rigged in a hunter's snare. Oren cursed. They're using military-grade tricks. This isn't poaching, it's execution. From the edge of the fire line, something moved. A man, face obscured, camo fatigues, holding what looked like a sniper rifle wrapped in cloth. He moved like he belonged. Confident, silent, too silent, until he caught sight of Maeve. She didn't run. She raised the camera strapped to her chest, not to photograph, but to record. Red light blinked, and he saw it, paused, then lifted his hand and made a subtle slicing motion across his neck. A warning, but she didn't stop in the chaos. The leopard reappeared, leaping from the low embankment, not toward Maeve, but behind the gunman. The man turned too late. Claws slashed across his shoulder. He screamed, not from pain, but shock, and staggered back, weapon falling. The leopard didn't linger. She disappeared again into the smoke. Maeve ran, grabbed the weapon, kicked it down into the ravine. The man groaned, clutching his torn jacket. Oren reached her seconds later, eyes on the injured man. Who the hell is he? Maeve shook her head. Not local, not government, someone private. Hired, but for what and why her? Behind them, the fire roared louder. Trees collapsing in sheets of flame. Helicopters circled overhead, dropping lines. Radio chatter flooding Maeve's headset. Evacuate Northridge. Firebreak failed. All units fall back. But Maeve refused to leave. Not without her. Not without the leopard. She's headed for the Stone Gorge. If she makes it there, she'll be safe from the fire, but they'll corner her before she reaches it. Maeve turned to Oren, voice raw. I need to go ahead. You get into the Rangers. Oren nodded reluctantly. Maeve vanished into the red haze. Each step felt heavier, air hotter, but she pressed on until she saw the blood, bright red streaks against burnt grass. Fresh, not mortal, but deep. She followed them, not knowing what she'd find. And then, through the trees, she saw her. The leopard, limping, smoke curling off her damp fur, eyes locked on Maeve. And beside her, impossibly, a cub, no older than 4 months, hidden until now. Trembling Maeve froze. The mother, despite the blood, despite the chase, had been circling, not just to fight, but to protect. Someone had tried to erase her, silence her, drown her in cold coke and fire, but she had rewritten the story with claw and will. And Maeve, now breathless and burned, raised her voice to the wind, not to call for help, but to warn, they're not prey, not anymore. In the distance, more gunfire, and the smoke thickened. But in the clearing, beneath falling ash, mother and cub stood together, scarred, soaked, undefeated. The war wasn't over, but the trail had changed, and blood had marked its turn. The morning after the fire, the valley was coated in ash, a soft gray veil that blurred everything, even time. The mountains were smoke like shawls, their ridges barely visible, and the rivers steamed faintly where the heat had kissed them overnight. It was as if the land itself had exhaled in grief, exhausted from witnessing its own burning heart. Celis stood on the ledge above the canyon, the charred remnants of acacia trees behind him like broken teeth. He hadn't spoken since they pulled Lara from the blaze, her breath shallow, her coat singed, the sticky residue of coke clinging like a cruel memory to her flanks. He didn't know what to say, not to Nia, not to the world, not even to himself. The leopard lay beneath a temporary canvas shelter, her chest rising and falling with a strange, unnatural rhythm. A faint gurgle echoed in her breath, remnants of the soda's carbonation, or maybe the beginnings of an infection. They had flushed her wounds with saline, cooled her burns with silver gel, but there were some things no antiseptic could reach. Nia crouched beside her, her fingers trembling as she checked. Lara's pulse again. Then she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't run. You didn't fight back. Why didn't? You fight back, but the leopard gave no answer, only a slow blink, and then another. That silence, it was heavier than any roar, more cutting than any claw. In the distance, the sound of engines, not poachers this time, but the department. Bureaucrats in uniforms and polished boots who hadn't set foot in the bush until it bled. They had come to assess damage, but Ellis knew what that meant. Their clipboards didn't hold sympathy, only policies, boxes to tick before they caged what they couldn't understand. He met them at the edge of the trail, eyes hard, shoulders squared. She's under care, and she's not going anywhere. His voice carried no room for negotiation. The tallest of the officials, a man with silver epaulets and city breath, tilted his head. That leopard is a documented danger. You know what she did to those boys last week. You saw the footage. Ellis didn't flinch. I saw a wild animal being humiliated, drenched in sugar, and laughed at. What she did was instinct. What they did was cruelty. Another official spoke, a woman with sun-shielded eyes. And what would you suggest? That we give her a pardon, rehabilitate a predator who's already maimed 2 civilians. Ellis stepped closer, eyes locked. I'm suggesting you let the forest decide, not your desks. If you take her now, she'll die before the week's end, and your city won't know what it lost, but we will. Behind them, Nia stepped forward, her voice quiet, but unwavering. She's not just any leopard. She's the last of her bloodline in this region. You tag her dangerous, but no one tagged the coke can. No one asked how a predator becomes a lesson in revenge. The officials fell silent. Only the chirp of returning cicadas filled the air between them. And then, slowly, the man with the silver epaulets pulled out a pen. We'll grant temporary sanctuary, but only if she's under direct supervision. Daily reports, full behavioral monitoring. Ellis nodded. It's a start. That night, as the stars returned to the scarred sky, Lara stirred, not with fear, but with strange gentleness. Her head lifted weakly, her eyes scanning the ridge. And then, she moved. Nia was there to see it. The way her body rose. Unevenly, shakily, but with intent. She didn't growl, didn't snarl. She simply walked to the edge of the clearing, where the moonlight fell through the burned treetops like silver threads, and sat. Ellis joined them. Moments later, standing just behind, his voice low. You know she could disappear tonight. She's strong enough now. Just enough. Nia nodded. But she won't, and she didn't over the next weeks. The silence turned from sorrow to something else, something sacred. Lara didn't just survive. She returned, not to them, but to the land. And the land slowly, hesitantly, welcomed her back. Ellis stopped updating the reports. Not because he forgot, but because the leopard no longer belonged to their pages. She was rewriting her own. One morning, Mia found her standing at the edge of the old creek bed, where the coke had first been thrown. She watched as Lara crouched low, dipping her paws into the same stream, rinsing them, almost ritually, as if erasing something or forgiving it. That was the moment Nia knew. This wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. Months passed, and the scars across the land began to green. Trees sprouted stubbornly from blackened roots. Insects returned. Birdsong threaded the morning air again, and in the far-off canyons, whispers grew of a leopard no one could catch. Not because she was hidden, but because she no longer needed to be. She had become something else. Not legend, not ghost, but proof. Proof that silence could scream louder than any gunshot. That dignity could survive even stickiest cruelty. That one wild creature, given the smallest chance, could rewrite everything we thought we knew. Years later, tourists would still ask about the trail near the scorched valley, about the cat who sat on the ridge without fear, about the ranger who left his badge for a camera, and the vet who stayed long after the funding ran out, and somewhere in those quiet hours before dusk. If they listened closely, they might hear it, the rustle of a leopard through the tall grass, a hush on the wind, the silence that changed them all. Cruelty may strike in an instant, but nature remembers far longer. Every reckless act leaves a mark. But so does every act of courage, and sometimes the wild rises not to attack but to awaken our humanity.